Good evening, everyone. I'm Luna Goldberg, the Education Manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. On behalf of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and the Global Jewish Studies program at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the next edition of our Monday at the Museum series, focusing on Black lives in a Jewish context. Tonight's event, Color and Jewish Identity in India, features Dr. Nathan Katz. Dr. Katz is Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the School of International and Public Affairs at FIU. He was the founding chair of the Department of Religious Studies, the Bhagwan Mahavir Professor of Jain Studies, the Kaufman Professor of Global Entrepreneurship in the College of Business Administration, and affiliated faculty in the College of Medicine, Director of Jewish Studies, and founder and director emeritus of the innovative program in the study of spirituality. He is also the co-founder and co-editor of the Journal of Indo-Judaic Studies. Throughout the program, members of the audience are encouraged to post questions to the Q&A section that I will later pose to Dr. Katz near the end of the program. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Nathan Katz.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. It's so nice to be back, as it were, at the Jewish Museum of Florida, where we spent many wonderful evenings on different intriguing programs and working with you all. Generally a wonderful experience. I'm so glad to see that Mondays at the Museum, a series we started quite a few years ago, is still running. So congratulations to everyone at the museum. Despite the fact that we can't come to the museum, you're keeping a very dynamic presence, and that's appreciated for sure. I want to shout out my friend and colleague Tudor Parfit for asking me to speak on this topic. Really, it's been quite edifying for me. A lot of the work my wife and I have done about the Jews of India has dealt with the question of color and caste and so on and so on. These things naturally emerge as questions. And I got to confess, I've been wrong in some very serious ways. The world has changed since we wrote this. Of course, consciousness of race and so forth in America is almost a fever pitch right now, paying a lot of attention to what had been a neglected topic, long-term for the better, I'm sure. But in the meantime, in India, there's a lot going on as well, intellectually, culturally, and that's a reassertion of sort of Hindu identity in the face of colonial identity, if we can simplify it. Of course, I'm an academic, it's more complicated, but that's essentially what it is. And the traditionalist Hindus object to the way most Westerners and Western-trained Indians study Indian culture. And they're very, very critical of the way we understand caste in particular, and speak scornfully about the Western approach to India as being caste, cows, and curry, meaning extremely trivial. They are not without merit in their position. So as I'm thinking about all this, a book that was on the bestseller list emerged in the United States by a journalist named Isabel Wilkerson by the name Caste. So of course, my interest is piqued. I don't read as easily as I once did, so I just looked at some reviews and so forth. And if I got the gist of the book, no more, that caste is to India what anti-Semitism is to Europe and what race is to America. So if you know anything about race or about anti-Semitism, as most of us probably know something, we just apply that in the same way to caste as some indigenous, oppressive bigotry at best. But is it? And what I'm finding out is it doesn't work that way. That Wilkerson's point that caste is the paradigm for both racism and anti-Semitism. I'm sorry, that's just wrong. I know this journalist was on with Oprah Winfrey, and she bought many copies of her books and gave them out. This is the answer. Caste is the paradigm. We just are following that model. Not true. In fact, what I'm going to try to tell you in complicated materials, almost the opposite is more true, that caste and color are more Western intrusions upon India than they are Indian models for Western oppression. So if we could, Laura, we could just start with... Okay, so the topic is color and Indian Jewish identity, or something like that. We learned when we were living in Cochin about a gentleman who you see on the right named Avram Barak A.B. Salem. And in fact, we were living in a house with his son to the left, Raymond Salem. And I'm going to tell you their story. The father was considered the Jewish Gandhi by many. And the system of relationships among the Jews of Kochi area, he calls Jewish apartheid. In fact, that's the title there of a major article that my wife and I wrote. I must, in all honesty and no false modesty, tell you that my wife did most of the research and writing on this part of it, as well as photography. So why you're listening to me and not her, I can't quite figure, but let's look at the next slide and get going. So the gentleman you see there is Vasco da Gama. You probably learned he circled the globe, Portuguese sailor, adventurer, whatever else he was. Among other things, he arrived in Kochi, which is just the town we're talking about, in around 1503. And right away set to work building a Catholic church on the right side. And it's the first Catholic church in India. Da Gama was shocked that when he got there, he found a lot of Christians whom he barely recognized to be Christians already there. There had been an indigenous Syriac version of Christianity, an Orthodox version of Christianity, from most likely the 4th century and perhaps earlier than that. So the Portuguese were rather late arrivals, but they thought they were bringing the true church or whatever they happened to think. Da Gama described the society he saw there in 1502 as one that had many casta. You will recognize the Indian English word caste from the Portuguese word casta. But the Portuguese word does not mean the same thing as the Anglo-English, the Indian English word caste. Casta means social class, full stop. That's what it means. But caste, as we come to think of it, means hereditary, hierarchically related subgroups of Indian society that ranked on a scale of purity and pollution and all this kind of metaphysical stuff, that all of which portrays an unchanging social order in India. And that should have raised our doubts right away, because the moment you start to describe a culture as unchanging, you are, well, that was pointed out by somebody I otherwise don't like so well, but was very smart nevertheless, Edward Said, in his book Orientalism, where he says perceptions of the Islamic world, and I would say, of course, the Hindu and other worlds over there, the perceptions as always this way, unchanging, incapable of change, etc. That is a common discourse. And I think we find that embedded in the Western concept of caste, which was, I won't say totally misapplied to India, but crudely applied. So we get the idea of caste. Here's where it starts, 1502. In 1686, a group of Jews from Amsterdam came to visit their co-religious in Kochi. First time the groups ever met, and the Amsterdam Jews, who actually are originally from Portugal and Spain, but the Amsterdam Jews took a census of the Indian Jews, and after each name in the family, the leader of the expedition would write either Blanco or Negro, white or black. And so we get embedded into India from outside in fairly recent times, 1686, this division of Jews into black and white. Those are colors. Those may be races, whatever they are. Those words become okurant, were used throughout India, throughout the world. And if when people know we wrote a book about Cochin, oh, black and white Jews, first thing people know. Let's see, next slide, please, Luna. All right, so there's a division in the community that the Amsterdam Jews called black and white. What was that division? So, and I'm arguing it's not just a color matter, or not even primarily that. So I want to go back to 1520. And I got to explain a little bit of Shaila Tshuva system in Rabbinic Judaism. That if I have a question to which I want an answer, a halakhic, a Judaic answer, I go to my rabbi and I ask a shaila. And I make clear, this is a shaila, which means it's binding. As opposed, I just want to ask you a question for my curiosity, and then nothing's binding. I say, I have a shaila, rabbi, that's a formal situation. And when the rabbi gets a shaila, he will respond with a tshuva, which means a response, a return. And these were letters, documents written down in response to the shaila. All right, shaila tshuva. Now, when you get far-flung Jewish communities, like in Cochin, and you have questions, maybe you probably can answer most everything, Judaic questions, but when there is something you don't know the answer to, you send a shaila to a rabbi outside of India. Maybe for a time it was Baghdad, Aleppo, Alexandria, later London, and the letters would be sent. And that could be done because the Cochin Jews were very big merchants and had ships going back and forth anyway. So they send a shaila, and eventually takes a while, well, we'll see, to get a tshuva back. So what we have is a tshuva written by a very eminent Sephardic rabbi of his day, Rabbi David ben Solomon ibn Zimra from Egypt. Now, when you write a tshuva, you restate the question. So here's his Ibn Zimra's voice. He says there are 900 families in Cochin. 100 are meyuchasim, and the rest, 800, are meshuchrarim. Big words, not black and white. Meyuchasim, meshuchrarim. This is what the division was, or how it was understood. Now, these meyuchasim, according to Ibn Zimra, they will not marry them, the meshuchrarim, calling them slaves. They refuse to intermarry with their co-religionists, who are, again, the meshuchrarim, the larger but lower status group, who are rich, devout, and charitable, rich and intimate royalty and princes. Now, this is strange. Here you have 100 Jews who are meyuchasim, lording it over 800 Jews who are meshuchrarim. They have everything. They're wealthy, they're devout, charitable, and they know the king, the maharajas, and so forth, and every one of whom matters in Cochin. But what they didn't have was a shichrur, thus the name meshuchrarim. A shichrur is a legal document in Judaism of manumission, freeing of a slave. Like every culture of its day in Judaism, in India, slavery was practiced. But it was also regulated. And if you had a slave, After a while, you should free them. And to free them, or for whatever reason you want to free them, and you should free them after an amount of time, you give them a document called a shichrur. And after which they do tabila, which is immersion in a ritual tank called a mikvah. Then they are called meshuchrarim. That is somebody who has this document. And they, by Jewish law, are to be considered Jews, which includes being marriageable. Look just above. The Meyachasim are saying we won't marry with the Meshuchrarim. They're wrong, says Ibn Zimra. And he is a great authority. Now, we don't have the original Shaila, but we have record that was written right around the year 1520. And so it took about 20 years to get the letter sent, read, received, studied, and replied to, but that may have been more timely back in the 16th century in India. Now, somebody in there wrote the same question again. We don't want to marry with these people. We're better than these people. So tell us, they're not really proper Jews. We're not converted. We don't have a shich. We're slaves or sons of slaves, whatever. Bad words. So they wrote to Ibn Zimra, who by that time had been replaced by Jacob de Castro in Egypt. Around 1540, de Castro wrote back and said the same thing. No, once they have a shechur and do tabila, immersion, they're Jews. You can't make any distinction. You have to marry them. You can eat with them. You can do anything. Again in 1882 and again in 1951, so recently, the same basic question was sent with the same basic response. Slide, please, Luna. All right. Now, the Shaila goes on to mention Meyachasim and Meshuchrarim. And the way we conceive of this is that substance trumps halakhic tradition. That is, in Jewish law, we know Jewish, anyone born of a Jewish mother or converted according to halakha, right? So, there is a substance dimension, that is the blood of the mother and the semen of the father. There is a substance involved, but ultimately, who is a Jew is a rabbinic decision, not purely simply birth. And when birth matters, it is the mother's birth only. The father doesn't count whatsoever in traditional Judaism in the Jewish identity of the next one. So the charge gets laid, they have tainted blood. The mother's blood is tainted. What is it tainted? They talk a lot about blood in these documents. There's blood of Jerusalem, which means they came from Jerusalem. They're claiming we have yichus, meyuchasim. We have yichus. That means descent from Jerusalem. And not only that, we have double yichus. We have blood from Kranganor, and that's a picture of 17th century Kranganor, which was the main port in the area at the time, and that's where the king lived and the Jews lived. And the Jews, in their stories and legend and so forth, emphasized this connection both to Jerusalem, the center of the Jewish universe, and to Kranganor, which was the center of the local universe, the Hindu universe of this region, right? So, for example, when there's a funeral, it is a custom that when the deceased eyes are closed, a bit of earth from Israel is placed in their eyes, then they're buried. In Cochin, when someone died, they would close their eyes with a bit of earth from Israel, from Jerusalem, and a bit of earth from Kranganor. See, they're really playing strong, this strong lineage. Color, that is not a Jewish issue, and I'm going to argue that's not an Indian issue really either. It is a European issue. So I guess the academic bottom line here is that whereas earlier scholars, including my earlier self, had thought that when you have halakha plus substance plus color, you get Indian Jewish identity. Now I want to say, when you add halakha, the shech or that kind of documents, the substance coming from the mother's blood, and color. Uniquely, you get a colonial era Indian Jewish identity. That is not traditional Indian Jewish identity, which is what I want to say. It is neither about color nor caste. Luna, please, the next one. All right, so since the 16th century, Baghdadis had yichus, that is, they convincingly would argue, we came from Jerusalem. They certainly knew European languages because many of them came from Europe, and they knew European trading practices. This was enormously useful to the economy of the local region. So they became very quickly favored by the royalty there. So they made the distinction here, these yichus people, the Hasim, made a distinction between foreign-born Jews and quote unquote native Jews based on this yichus from Israel. By the way, incidentally, in this part of India, Christians and Muslims do the same. They distinguish between Christians who came from Syria, from the Holy Land, from where the seat of their church is. Muslims came from Arabia during the lifetime of the prophet. They're the original ones, and converts were of a lower order. And eventually, just as the Jews had separate synagogues for the two groups, Christians had separate churches and Muslims had different masjids or mosques. In 1686, nevertheless, de Paiva, the leader of the Amsterdam delegation, notes the separation, no intermarriage, no counting for minyanim, for prayer quora, no meat from the other's ritual slaughter, and so forth. But, now this is a new name, Malabari. I'm going to call now those who were called Meshuchrarim, I'm going to call them Malabari. Cochin is the name of the region. Malabar is the name of the larger region of which Cochin is a part. So the Malabaris lived in Cochin and around Cochin. Cochin Jews lived in the town. So the Malabaris also had lineage claims, and they claimed a Jerusalem origin as well. So here's the evidence. You're looking at it. The copper plates, very famous things, which were written by the Maharaja, bequeathing or giving autonomy, land, right to raise taxes, honors, privileges in society to who he calls Yosef Rabban, a Jew, and his descendants. Then he has a name for the group, Anshufanim, and these people have, the Jews there called an independent state. It's an autonomous principality, something like that. And these plates determine this is the charter, the declaration that creates that autonomous state. Who owns them now? They're kept today in the Cochin synagogue among the Michasim Jews, but the Meshucharim Jews, the Malabar Jews, say, no, they were taken from us, and we really have the real ones. So you get this rival claim that we're never going to settle, who has the real yichus? Let's go. Una. All right. Now I'm going to make it more complicated. You had two groups, now you're going to have four. Because each group, we're going to call them now the Paradesi, which means foreign Jews. Not that they were all foreign, but they're the ones who came after the Spanish and Portuguese expulsion. They joined up with some of the original Jews who are the upper class of that original community. Jews came from Yemen, from here and there. They formed a community called Paradesi, or foreigners, as opposed to the Malabaris, who were the much longer resident Jews in this region, quite possibly 2,000 years. That's another lecture on the history. Each group, the Paradesis and the Malabaris, held slaves. The Paradesis came to call their slaves Meshuchrarim, because they gave them this shechrur document. Whereas the Malabaris called them by a Malayalam name, or makar, which comes to the same thing. Now, we're going to talk about the Jewish Gandhi, A.B. Salem, who is a mishuchrar. That is, he is of the Cochin Jews. His family were slaves or something like that. They were manumitted, given the document. Even with the document and even with the immersion, the tabila, they were imposed upon them disabilities, no intermarriage, no interdining. Sometimes they weren't even allowed in this gorgeous here, the Paradesi Synagogue, 1568, or they were given only menial roles there. None of the lower groups, so-called, were called to read before the Torah, to make blessings, to lead the services. They had to sit in the back. You can imagine how it is. Okay, Luna, the next one, if you please. So, just repeating, the Meshuchrarim were the manumitted slaves and their descendants, as well as a few what are called Yalidei Bayits, children of the house, which are basically the offspring of the Paradesi father and a servant. They may or may not have a formal conversion, but their father is Jewish. They were sort of part of this group, and it included the converts. They did not have a synagogue. They had instead very diminished rules in the Paradesi synagogue. They could not have called to the Torah. They couldn't chant certain prayers. They could not bury their dead in coffins. They couldn't marry the white, to use that word again, or Paradesi woman, and they couldn't sit on benches. They had to sit on floors. Every one of these things is against Jewish law. Every one of these disabilities. Ever since 1840, members of this group of the Meshuchrarim were challenging the status quo. There was a fellow named Avo, a Yelad Bayit, a child of the house, led an unsuccessful rebellion to claim their rightful position in the synagogue. The whites appealed to the prime minister, the Dewan, who scolded the Meshuchrarim, saying you should walk submissively to the white Jews. So the government entirely took the side of the privileged. Luna, next one, please. So along comes Avram Baruch Salem, the grandson of Avo, who led the rebellion, who was born in 1882. And you see on your right a photo of Avram Salem on the right, and Yitzhak ben Tzvi. Was he the second president of Israel or the first president? I'm not sure. But he was very interested in Jews from the so-called third world, from so-called exotic communities. So when Salem went to Israel, he was hosted and welcomed by the government of Israel. Today there is the Yitzhak ben Tzvi Institute in Jerusalem, which contains a wonderful library and collection of artifacts from Jewish communities in India and elsewhere. AB was the first university graduate from this Meshuchrarim group. He studied law, but he became an activist and an orator, a social organizer. He championed low-caste workers. He got elected to the legislature. And in 1929, he went to the meeting of the Indian National Congress seeking independence from Britain, met in Lahore, and there he met with Mahatma Gandhi and other Congress leaders. Now, he became totally enamored of Gandhi and Nehru. He called them the Moses and the Aaron of their group. So AB learns about Gandhi's methods, techniques, and so forth. Also, as happened would be, near to Cochin in a town called Vaikom in Travancore, the next princely state, Gandhi led a civil disobedience campaign, a satyagraha, against the temple. Many Indian temples refused entry to the lowest strata of society. So Salem felt, well, we're the lowest strata of this Paradesi society, and we're denied entry to our temple. Aha. So, inspired by what Gandhi was doing, he started a satyagraha, civil disobedience, at the synagogue. And he won. It took time. It began in 1937. In 1942, the first reading of a blessing for the additional part of the Torah reading. They're allowed to be buried in the cemetery in a coffin, but no mixed weddings would be sanctified in the synagogue. That end the story rather abruptly after much struggle and a great deal of pain. People suffered, still lingering. In my 1978, AB's great-grandson married in the synagogue. And so the last barrier of this apartheid system had fallen. The name apartheid was given in 1951 by the chief rabbi from South Africa who was visiting. He was horrified and said, "This is apartheid." And so it was up to this remarkable figure, A.B. Salem, to bring together Gandhi's activism and Jewish values, and eventually succeeded. Luna. Okay, so that's my story of color or caste in Cochin. It's not color and it's not caste. It's something else. And in order to get prestige, they behaved in ways that would reflect well on them in the eyes of the elite, the Maharajas, and the royalty. Now, a second and the largest group of Indian Jews are known as Bnei Yisrael, or as pronounced in India, the Bnei Israel. And this is a Bnei Israel synagogue and some people. And the Bnei Israel themselves are divided into Gora and Kala. Gora means white, Kala means black. I challenge anybody by looking to tell me the difference between the two. Gora and Kala are entirely matters of yichus, of lineage. And one part, the Gora, were, for whatever reasons, ascribed higher, a better lineage and higher status, and the Kala were not. This is gone. However, I remember when we were first studying there, 40, 50 years ago, I remember it's still, you could find some of the older Bnei Israel who remember what this was like, and how one said in particular, I was never allowed to eat in their house even, but now my children can eat in their children's house, that there was a kind of rigid separation based on yichus, not on color, even though the words are white and black. That's not so involved or interesting. Next, please, Luna. Now we get another long story and complicated story of the Baghdadi Jews and the Bnei Israel Jews. Now there's a picture, Shah Rachamim synagogue from 1796, Bombay's oldest synagogue, built by Bnei Israel people. So, real quick, in 1848, the Pasha, the king of Basra in southern Iraq, declared war on Iran. A little familiar, Iran-Iraq war? No, a little bit. Daoud Pasha lost the war and his money. Daoud Pasha had a secretary of the treasury whose name was David Sassoon. Sassoon was the leader of the Jewish community and one of the wealthiest people in Basra. What the Pasha did was, what does a king do? When he has a war, he loses his money and he needs more money, and there's Jews around who have money, you take it, which he did. He took Sassoon's money, but Sassoon's smart, he kept some. And he and his family hightailed it out of Basra. It was no longer a place that they could live. And he moved Surat first and then to Mumbai. because Bombay was just being developed by the British. And, that was the game in town in this planet at the day, the British Empire. So I figured if I go there, there's going to be a lot of opportunity, as indeed there was. So in the second half of the 19th century, Baghdadis arrived in Mumbai. They were very happy because they found there 50 years before, the Bnei Israel had a synagogue. They could pray in a synagogue. They had a cemetery. They had a shochet, meat, everything they needed. They got along just fine. So we get so you have cooperation, but it doesn't last long. And we got to talk the whole phenomenon of newly arrived versus established Jewish communities. Like in New York City, the Germans were the first Jews to arrive there and establish themselves very well. And they began to be followed by lots of Eastern European Jews who were, as they put them, difficult relations. That is, the Eastern European Jews were too Jewish, the beards and the black clothes and the long dresses. They were Eastern European, not sophisticated people, whereas the German Jews in New York were. So they looked down. They were an embarrassment, right? So the established group lorded it over the newly arrived group. In Mumbai, the opposite. The newly arrived, the Baghdadis, were higher status, namely richer than the Bnei Israel, and they began to look down at them. But at first, the Baghdadis acted as both colleagues, co-religionists of the Bnei Israel, gladly sharing their synagogues, butcher, cemetery, ritual baths, etc. And at the same time, they were patrons of the Bnei Israel because they were more knowledgeable, and they began to teach in their synagogues and perform ritual functions for them. So that's the early stage. Luna, if you please. Now, they also came, so I got to commend this wonderful book by Professor Joan Rowland, my dear friend, Jews in British India, Identity in a Colonial Era. Wonderful work on this topic. So that's Bombay. Calcutta, the first so-called Baghdadi Jews didn't come from Iraq. They came from Aleppo. And they started to set up shop in Calcutta, which then was the capital. Mumbai was the new town, and became very prosperous as well. And then the other Jews heard about it, and they came, and there were a lot of Iraqis from Baghdad, and Turks and Afghans and Persians and Yemenites. Everybody came to Calcutta as well. However, for reasons no one knows, these groups of Jews from Basra, from Aleppo, from all those places were called and are called in India Baghdadi Jews. In Mumbai, they still follow Baghdadi customs and style of prayer and liturgy and chanting. In Kolkata, they had a mixture of customs from Aleppo and from Iraq. Who are they? Baghdadis, that's a funny name. It's not a good name. So one woman from Kolkata, a Jewish woman, calls them Arabian Jews of India and the Far East, which is a good name. Most of them spoke Arabic. They came with a kind of Arabic identity, whether from Iraq or from Syria. They were living in India, and very quickly they spread satellite communities as merchants all through Southeast Asia, from both Mumbai and Calcutta. Trading communities were set up in Burma, in Singapore, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in China, Japan, and so on, Kobe, Tokyo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, all this. And these groups would trade and interact with each other. That even though they were far apart, the ships, they were merchants, the ships went back and forth, they'd take newspapers, they'd make marriage partners, they'd send matzah if they needed matzah. Another name for this group is the name of a book called Jews of the Raj, which is good also because they came there when the British Raj started, and they left when the British left. Jews of the Raj, good name, commonly known as Baghdadis. In Mumbai, the Jews there, the Baghdadis, became very good friends with various mercantile communities, of course, both Indian and foreigners, especially the Parsis. Parsi, you might recognize the word Persia in there. Fars, the old name. Parsis are followers of the ancient Iranian religion called Zoroastrianism. But they were small, highly educated, very great business acumen group. They were the natural partners for the Baghdadi Jews there. Similarly, in Calcutta, the Jews there moved in the neighborhood of the Armenian Christians, and they became good friends with the Armenians. They were also a foreign mercantile community. They would do business together and became socially close. So you get the same idea. You get a reference group that becomes your mentor in adapting to a new culture. However, Parsis, Armenians, yes, but gradually their reference group became the British. Luna. Now, things were fine and dandy. The Jews were living there. They were getting along more or less. The Indians were sort of getting along with the British more or less until 1857, when we have the deterioration of relations with the Bene Israel. Now, what was going on? As mentioned, the Baghdadi Jews increasingly identified with the British. They were very wealthy, cultured people. They saw themselves as peers of the highest echelon, the British. They never were accepted, of course, but they were high up there. But to identify with the British, they saw the British look down on Indians, so they had to look down on Indians, adopt the snobbery of the people you wish to emulate. Good way to do it. The Indians they knew best were the Bene Israel. So tragically, the Baghdadis began to look down on the Bene Israel. So, in 1857 was the event, as pictured here, what the British called the Mutiny of 1857, which is typical British understatement of the reality. The Indians called it the First War of Independence, which may be a little bit closer. The Indians wanted the British out, and the sepoys, the army, rose up against the British officers. And it was going all over North India. It was very brutal. And relations between Indians and British, and therefore between Bene Israel and Baghdadis, were never the same. Even in this independence struggle, the Baghdadis supported the British in the war in 1857, while the Bene Israel supported the Indians. You get it? So who are these people? Baghdadis, Sephardim, European. The history of the Baghdadis, aside from their tremendous accomplishments in business and construction and leadership in civic activities and scholarship, despite all that, the Baghdadis wanted something a little bit, a name that would make them closer to British. So in China, in fact, the same people call themselves Sephardim, because Sepharad means Spain, so they're Spanish, so they're sort of European. Didn't work there either very well. But they wanted to be, the goal was to be European. So Baghdadis in India, Sephardim in China, all in this quest for acceptance at the top of society. Luna. Now, after World War I, right, this was the new synagogue in town, Knesset Eliyahu, built in that's the wrong year. It's built in 1883. Grand Baghdadi synagogue in Mumbai. After World War I, the British are more engaged in the day-to-day management of everything Indian. Their system, their hierarchy, etc., was overlaid on the Indian indigenous hierarchy. So when the British ruled, they gave the benefits of society to the Europeans as the highest order. And what I mean is scholarships to study at Oxford or Cambridge. What I mean is how much salary you get if you're a train engineer. It depends who you are, how much you get paid if you're a postal worker or a soldier. It depends who you are. Who got into college? Depends which group you're in. That's the British style. So if you're British, you get the most. If you're European, not British, you get the next most. If you're Eurasian, mixed breed, so to speak, you get the next. And if you're a mercantile caste, and then native. That's how they saw it. The Baghdadis wanted to be close to the British, like European, maybe Eurasian. That's the struggle. But part of that struggle was the distancing from the Beni Israel. So there are many Beni Israel in India, in Mumbai. So the Baghdadis there rejected the Beni Israel and all things Indian. They excluded the Beni Israel community from Baghdadi cemeteries and from most of Jewish life. And they even went so far as to claim their religion was a different one from the Beni Israel. In a way, I draw an analogy, the Beni Israel to the British are a shadow self. Excuse me. The Beni Israel are to the Baghdadis as the Anglo-Indians are to the British. Anglo-Indians mixed, and whom the British largely saw as a shadow self. Yeah, they ate our food, sort of, and they had names like ours, and they spoke English, of course, but they're not us, really, whatever kind of considerations came in. So they were a shadow self. And it was sort of the existence and flourishing of Anglo-Indians was a kind of, dare I say, an embarrassment to the British. In a similar way, the successes of the Beni Israel became a kind of embarrassment to the Baghdadis. They were denied ritual honors in synagogues. They would not eat meat from their ritual slaughters and did not count them for the minyan. A little similar to what we saw in Cochin, but different reasons. Luna, one more, please. So there's a direct relationship emerged between the relative numbers of British vis-a-vis the Beni Israel. The fewer the British, the greater level of animus toward the Beni Israel. That is, as the British-oriented Baghdadis diminished, their level of distaste towards the Beni Israel increased. And to make their matters worse, World War I time, who were the Baghdadis? They come from Baghdad. Not really, but okay. So what's Baghdad? That's part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And who were the Ottomans? They're the enemies of the British, the Turks, during World War I. So if you're Ottoman, you're an enemy, right? So that led to greater hostility of the British toward the Baghdadis, and because they're Ottoman, not Eurasian, and therefore their animosity towards the Beni Israel. So the Beni Israel were lost. What do we do? What kind of nationalism? Who are we? The Anglicization, the independence movement called Swaraj, Zionism. They generally conflicted with the first option, which the Baghdadis, Anglicization, accepted. So now they're torn between Indianization and Judaization, Swaraj and Zionism. More and more distance, Baghdadi charities excluded Beni Israel. The Baghdadi attitude repeatedly, as the Cochini attitude, was criticized by foreign rabbis, but they were ignored. And as the struggle between Baghdadis and British intensified, so did the struggle between Baghdadis and Beni Israel. Next one, please, Luna. Over in Yangon, that's Rangoon in Burma, in 1913, they built this gorgeous synagogue, Masmei Yeshua. But they too, that was largely Baghdadi community. They barred the Beni Israel from aliyahs, from honors. Why? Oh, they didn't observe Shabbat strictly enough. Well, what they did, their marriages weren't proper performed. Always some reason. The Beni Israel took it to courts in Rangoon, the British courts, to demand greater synagogue participation. And the High Court didn't know what to do. The British High Court, they referred the matter to the London Beit Din Rabbinic Court. And the Beit Din in London reviewed that the Bnei Israel were no different from other Jews and should be treated accordingly. So they got the ruling through the courts, and guess what? The litigation continues in Yangon, in Burma, in Mumbai, and ultimately it continued even when they all moved to Israel. Next, Luna. So how did this mess work out or not work out, or where did it get resolved? It sort of did, sort of didn't. But I want to tell you about this family here, Israel Nahum, Isaac Nahum, I'm sorry, who was the proprietor of Nahum's Bakery. It's the kosher bakery in Kolkata, but it's much, much, much more than that. Try it. If you work with anybody from Calcutta, ask them about Nahum's, and they'll tell you about it. It's everybody in Nahum knows it and loves it. They go there, and they love especially to get the Jewish pastries. So he makes honey cake at Rosh Hashanah time, and there aren't enough Jews to buy their honey cakes, I assure you, but they're very popular. Wonderful macaroons. When we take our groups, tour groups to Calcutta, we sit in a hotel, get them tea, and run out to the store and get the macaroons from Nahum's. Nahum's was the center not only of Calcutta Jewish life, but for this whole Far Eastern diaspora of the Baghdadis. If there was a wedding going to be performed in Singapore, and the groom was from Kobe, Japan, and the bride is from Singapore, guess where the cake came from and had to come from? Nahum's in Calcutta. So everything, even though it's a very transnational community, it was very, very deeply connected. Well, after independence, the Jews, the Raj, left, except for a few, from both Mumbai and Kolkata, the Baghdadi Jews. But those who stayed, I want to talk about those few who stayed, have such a different, radically changed idea about who Indians and Hindus, etc., were than what they had been told and what they had believed in the past. And I remember sitting with Mr. Nahum, and he's talking, he says, look at these people. Is there anywhere in the world a more civilized, educated, kind, and charming people than these Indian people? And he says, I know that according to our Torah, we're supposed to despise idolaters. But if you know these people, you must love them because of who they are and get over that. And that's the end of the story, that gradually the Baghdadis left, but those who remained, and there still are some wonderful Baghdadis there in both Mumbai and Calcutta, they're relating to the Bnei Israel the way all Baghdadis should have, but it's such a difference in time and place. I tell you, under the colonial influence, and this is my main thesis, categories of color and caste became adopted in India. Those are not Indian categories. And therefore, they got adopted by Indian Jews as well. They were Indian. It was not that Jews in India adopted Indian prejudices. On the contrary, the Jews in India, paradoxically, adopted British European prejudices. When the British and Europeans are gone, no more prejudice, at least in this accord. Luna, that's it. So we can go to Q&A. We have a few minutes. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
So I've asked the audience to send their questions in the chat, and there's a Q&A section. I also have a couple of questions, so maybe I'll start us off, and then as they come in,
I'll try.
So one of my questions, and you've done a great job of telling us about the context and this history, and I wonder if there are sharp distinctions between Black and white Indian Jews that live on in Israel? Oh, Nathan, unmute. Sorry, we missed you.
So the answer to the question, how are relations among Indian Jews in Israel? Do they still have these prejudices? The answer is no. I can't say what may be in some older people's hearts, but you see no evidence of it. When there's an event, the community is all there. When there is, and so forth. That is all this kind of casteism, if that's the right word, and color prejudices. They were a condition of the time and place. New time, new place. Now, if anybody is listening there from Israel that wants to say that I'm wrong, I'm happy to learn.
Thank you. We also have another question from one of our docents at the museum, Elaine Litvak, and she asks, how do the Jews remaining get along with the Hindus and the Muslims?
Well, I want to say absolutely beautifully. It's no longer as true as it was. And that's, I hate to say it, but it's true. Largely due to the impact of radical Islamic elements in India. A great number of Indians go to the Middle East to earn a living. Gulf states, there they are somehow get in with the wrong masjid, the wrong mosque, I guess. And when they come back to India, they're rich. So they build a house and then they build a mosque. Right? They make that much money. So the mosque, who's going to run the mosque? They bring in some of these sort of jihadists or Islamists, whatever word we use, and they're spreading this kind of doctrine, especially, and this is particularly painful, in the state of Kerala, in that area where the Cochin Jews use, which for hundreds and hundreds of years has been held up around the globe as the model for interreligious harmony. And I can say a lot about that. But now, but in Cochin, my wife and I lived there for a year, researching for our book and making friends. And every night there was a get together at one of the elder Jews' house called the drinking party. And around the table would be some of the Jews, Christian neighbor from up the street, Muslim lawyer who went to college, in the old days with the Jewish lawyers there, they're old buddies. Jains, the president of the Jain temple, was the best friend of everybody. Hindus. Now, these are older people who they have the real spirit of thing. That is still there. But
wow, wonderful. Yeah.
But with the injection of the jihadist teachings in some of the mosques there, let me put it this way: always in India, I'd wear a kippah wherever I went. And it was always a great conversation starter. Oh, you're from Israel? No, I'm a Jew. Oh, please take tea. I want to ask you questions. It's so wonderful. It's a lovely thing. I can do that now only in some parts of India. And in other parts, frankly, it's not safe. And it breaks my heart.
Wow. Someone else asked, are there large Orthodox communities in India or Hasidim?
Well, there is Chabad in India that largely serves Israeli tourists and visitors, though they welcome Indians as well. And I don't know the exact number. I don't think anybody does. About a dozen or so different Chabad centers, Chabad houses around India, maybe more by now. So that's it. All the other synagogues, with one exception, are Sephardic. And Sephardim don't have Orthodox conservative reform. They just have Sephardic. And there's one standard of Judaism, and you live up to it as much as you do or don't, rather than divide it up as we Ashkenazim do. So there's one difference. There is one Reform synagogue, defiantly self-identified Reform synagogue in Mumbai. But otherwise, they don't join up with those labels.
Thank you. Someone else is asking about the Bnei Yisrael, who date themselves back to the first temple. Can you
the Bnei Israel?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. Actually, they date themselves back to the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. So is that 7th or 8th century BC or something? That's what they say. That's true. That's what they say. Can I not say more?
And we have another question who asks, where did the first Jews come from in India?
Okay. It's somewhat of a conjecture, right? But I've really done a lot of digging on this. So let me start with absolute 100% physical stone evidence that they were there 9th century in South India. Now, we also have documents written in Hebrew from the 8th century in the same area. All right, push it back. But then we have letters written by the leaders in the Orthodox and Catholic churches describing this community there. That puts them back to the 2nd century, which is very long ago. And when you study what happened in the 1st century, that's when the Greeks discovered monsoon winds, which means if you put a boat in the water off of Arabia, in 3 months, you end up in Cochin, more or less. And if you wait a couple months and put it back, you get back. It was like a super highway for trade in those days, 1st century. And we also have in some Jewish literature from the era, Josephus and Philo, wonderful things said about Hindus. They admired Hindus in 1st century Israel. They thought they were great. They're a model of faith. So given A, that Israel in the 1st century knew about India and thought of it well, that shipping lanes made travel to India much simpler, and the temple was destroyed and they had to run somewhere, it makes very good sense, very plausible that their claim of the 1st century with the destruction of the temple, I think holds a good deal of water, though it's not 100% solid.
Wonderful. So I'm going to take our final question, which I think is a great note to end on.
Okay.
And it's from Barbara Gherkin, and she asks, are you still leading tours to India?
Thank you.
And if so, where can we get that information?
Okay. Well, we are hoping that conditions in the world will make it possible for January 2023. To be honest, it's not going to be already this coming January. So we're looking for January 2023. I wonder if this person has any way of finding me on Facebook or on email, and I can link her to our webpage about our tours. It's called India, My Second Home, 2ND, India 2ND Home, indiamysecondhome.com. That's too much. Get in touch with me. I'm sure the museum people can track me down if need be.
Yes, I've just dropped that in the chat.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again to Dr. Katz for this informative lecture, and to
Very fun.
my co-sponsors, the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and the Global Jewish Studies program at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Thank you all for joining us. We hope we'll see you again very soon, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.